Okay. Good morning, everybody. I know we'll have some folks joining us as we get started, but we have a lot of content that we'd like to cover for you all today. So I want to go ahead and get started right away. We'll be talking today about a whole lot of new research on social emotional learning from the Core PACE Research Partnership. The agenda for the webinar, in short, is that there's a little bit of drinking out of the fire hose. We have 6 new studies that we release next week. And so we're doing a little bit of a speed presentation with several of these researchers to share with you the findings, and then we'll have some time at the end for question and answer. But we've heard from many of you on the phone that the best way to get some of this information is a meeting like this, where we can talk about and have the researchers talk about the findings. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. But all joking aside, more specifically, here's our agenda. First, we'll have Dave Calhoun talk about the background on CORE's SEL measurement. I'll talk a bit about our broad body of research on social emotional learning and how this new work fits in. Erin Fall will talk about a middle school drop, consistent gender differences in student self-efficacy. Susanna Loeb and Susanna Claro will talk about 2 studies on growth mindset and self-management. Hunter Gelbach will talk about research on understanding the extent to which students are satisficing on surveys. And finally, Libby Pierre will talk about how social emotional learning is playing out in classrooms across the core districts. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So just a reminder that there is a question and answer feature in Zoom, and you should ask any of your questions in there. If it's something that the researchers can answer but in written form, then they will do so. And if it's a question that should be brought to the whole group, we'll do that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Calhoun.
Thank you, Heather. Looks like you've still got control of the screen, which is fine.
All right,
here we go.
There you
okay.
go, Dave.
And you know what, Heather, it looks like I'm back to not being able to move the slides.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just a little bit about context here for the core districts to give us a little bit of perspective here. 8 core districts started collaborating as a group of districts. You can see them here on the slide about 10 years ago or so, and really working toward this idea of continuous improvement and how can we leverage the opportunity to work together to see how we can do a more effective job at reaching our kids and being successful with them. The 8 districts cover about 1 million students, about 1,600 schools, and about 50,000 teachers. A couple of years ago, we actually expanded that a little bit and created another layer of districts collaborating called the Data Collaborative, the Core Data Collaborative. And for our slides to advance here. There we go. Okay, so there's our 8 districts, which has had another 80 plus, probably over 100 school districts participating now. And there's about 2 million students in the state. And as a part of the collaborative work that we've done, we've realized the need to develop an opportunity to be able to really learn from each other, and having a common database of student information and building off of that a data dashboard, we realized was really an important feature to have as a part of the work that we do here. And so throughout our time, first during a wave when we had a accountability waiver, and then as No Child Left Behind sunsetted and we moved into the ESSA world, focusing on continuous improvement, building out the dashboard that all of the districts contribute to give us an opportunity to have a chance to look at how schools are doing, how different student groups are doing within schools, according to a set of metrics that we defined together as a set of school districts. Dashboard measures that are a part of the dashboard. Sorry, folks, here. Advancing the slides is a little bit wonky here. There we go. Includes several metrics that we have in the dashboard that are a part of the state accountability system. Another set of measures that are locally driven that we've actually built metrics for. And student social emotional learning is those features. It's a part of the measurement system that we have for CORE. And so as we take at what the dashboard actually looks like, we can see that social learning, based on annual surveys, is one of the features of the dashboard that we have. Here's just a set of all the different metrics that are available, and you can see from the panel in front that we're measuring several social emotional learning constructs from our annual survey that we provide. And so that's available to all of the districts. And so let's talk just a little bit too about the core survey that we have for social emotional learning. Here we go. We've actually been covering the years from 2015 to 2009, about 500,000 students a year in grades 4 through 12, probably in the neighborhood of just about 30 districts. Amongst all of those districts are now participating and been an opportunity for districts to engage in continuous improvement using social emotional learning constructs and results that they have. And a lot of our researchers have been able to do some great work too. Just in terms of history, I said about covering about 5 years worth of time. We began back in fall of 2013 with pulling folks together to develop this piece that we have here. And then in some piloting in 2014 and 2014-15, some field testing with full implementation of the surveys starting in 2015-16 and beyond. We've also done some development work around like how about streamlining things, or how might we consider introducing new ideas here. And we've been doing that work in our innovation zone where we get to pilot test some things. Moving on to our next slide here, the constructs that we have are growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. These are the districts have decided to be a part of the survey. And then just moving on again here, looking at things, so 14 and 17, growth mindset had 4 items, self-efficacy had 4 items, self-management started with more items and started with 9 items, and we've actually been doing some streamlining of that. It's down to 5 items, and social awareness started with 8 and is also at 5 items. As we've gone over some of our development work here.
Great.
And so that, I'm sorry, we were just a little funky with slide advancement there, but that just gives you a quick overview. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks so much, Dave. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of prior research on SEL and how this new work fits in before we turn it over to the new work. So for anyone that's interested, you can go to our website and look at all of the publications that we've produced via the Core PACE Research Partnership. Not all of them are on social emotional learning, but many are, because when you measure something new like what Core has done, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand those metrics and their use. And so we have done a lot of things to that end, really trying to unpack how scores should be calculated and reported, understanding bias in how students answer the questions, how SEL measures are related to themselves and to other behavioral measures, how they can be used to support school improvement in a multi-metric system. Really understanding whether improvement in SEL leads to improvement in academics, how schools and teachers contribute to students' growth, whether SEL outcomes vary for different student groups, understanding the measures and the consistency across administrations and respondents, and finally, how the survey itself can be continually improved. And so today we're going to, the studies that we'll be highlighting fall into understanding a bit in these buckets. So how teachers contribute to students' growth, whether SEL outcomes vary for different student groups and how that's related to outcomes, and understanding potential sources of bias. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Erin, who will talk about what we've learned in understanding students' self-efficacy. So Erin, you should have control of the screen.
All right, I think we're good to go. So I'm Erin Faley, and I'm going to be presenting research about gender differences in student self-efficacy that I've done with Monica Lee and Susanna Loeb. We'll be talking shortly. And I want to start just by defining what is self-efficacy. And in our paper, that's going to be the confidence a student has in their academic ability or their ability to succeed in school. And we're going to measure that through a series of 4 questions, as we just alluded to, where the students are asked how confident they feel about certain tasks, like earning an A in their classes, doing well on their tests, mastering hard topics, and meeting their learning goals. And they'll rate those from not at all confident to very confident. And what do we know about academic self-efficacy? Well, first, it's positively correlated with academic achievement. So students who believe that they're going to do better in school tend to actually do better in school. Moreover, students who are high achieving, we believe that that prior success in their achievement actually boosts their academic self-confidence. So that aspect of it as well, it's a bi-directional relationship between the two. From prior work actually using the PACE core data, we know that self-efficacy tends to decline in middle school. Younger students in 3rd grade tend to be more confident about their ability to do well in school than students who progress into middle school and high school who are less confident. And in particular, what motivated this work is that female students have a particularly sharp decline during middle school, where it leads to a male favoring gap. And I'm going to show you that. One thing that we really explore in this paper is whether or not those gender disparities in self-efficacy vary by student characteristics, so racial ethnic subgroups, income subgroups, or vary across school contexts, because we might believe that the gender disparities for one group don't look like the gender disparities for another, given intersectionality. So how we're going to do that is we are going to look at this, the survey responses for those 4 self-efficacy questions from about 800,000 students that were in 3rd through 12th grade during 5 years, the 2014-15 through 2017-18 school year, in 5 districts in 813 schools. We are going to model the average self-efficacy for students in those groups, as well as the difference between female and male self-efficacy within racial, ethnic, income, and prior achievement subgroups. And we're also going to see whether or not self-efficacy levels and gender gaps vary among schools. So to get us started, I want to just give a picture that's going to look a little bit reminiscent if you've seen some of the prior PACE core work. It shows that female students' self-efficacy in orange, male students' self-efficacy in blue, and the vertical line is the gap between males and females in the self-efficacy. And I'm going to go ahead and just label that for you, and that's going to be important as we transition to the next slide. But what we see in general is that female students start out with higher self-efficacy in 3rd grade and 4th grade. Around 5th and 6th grade, we see a turning point between the two where female students start to drop off much faster than male students in self-efficacy. And it switches over to being male favoring in 6th grade. You'll note that the steepest decline in this graph actually occurs between 6th and 7th grade. So that's when we're really seeing self-efficacy decline, but much faster again for female students than male students, leading to what we're noting as a consistent male advantage during the middle school and high school years. And so I want to just switch how we're looking at this graph to contextualize the plots that I'm going to show you in a second, which shows that we're actually going to look directly at the gap rather than the levels of self-efficacy. So if you note the 0.16 gap in 3rd grade followed by the 0.11, as we switch to this next plot, what you're going to see is I'm actually mapping those numbers, the size of the gap between females and males. You'll see that positive gap in early elementary school followed by the decline and male favoring gap after that. So we see that shift. That's going to form the baseline for a few of the other pictures that I'm going to show you. As we move on to look between different groups, I wanted to start with the average self-efficacy of each of the race, income, and achievement groups about variation. And we do see significant variation among different subgroups of students. So white students tend to have the highest average efficacy, and Latinx students the lowest average efficacy amongst the racial groups that we're looking at. Students who receive free and reduced price lunch, those who typically come from poorer family backgrounds, have lower self-efficacy than their non-poor peers. And low achieving students tend to have lower self-efficacy than the high achieving students that they're being compared to. So these are the average levels. But when we look within any one of these groups at the differences between males and females, they're strikingly consistent. So within every racial group that I'm showing on this plot, you can see that the dots in third grade all start positively. So that's signaling that female students are more confident than male students in third grade. And as it goes down, you notice by sixth grade that the gap is negative. So males are more confident than females. And it continues to stay negative with males being more confident than females for all of these groups in all of these later grades. We see similar trends when we look at income groups. So you have the free and reduced price lunch receipt group and the group that did not. Despite the big differences in their average self-efficacy, we don't see big differences in the gender gap or how it changes over grades. And finally, here with prior test scores, whether or not the student was high scoring in the prior year, kind of average scoring or low scoring, the trend in the gap, the size of the gap over these grades is very, very similar. So regardless of what subgroup students come from or are representing in this case, the gender achievement gap looks remarkably consistent. Next, we turn to look at schools. So whether or not self-efficacy varies across schools and whether or not we see different gender gaps in self-efficacy across schools. And we do see that students in different schools have different kind of average levels of self-efficacy. We looked at whether or not that was related to the school climate, and there is some suggestive evidence that self-efficacy is higher in schools where students report that they're in a more supportive learning environment, that they have a higher sense of belonging, or that discipline is fair. But what we note in the paper is that the climate explains really very little of the variation across schools in average levels of self-efficacy. And it turns out that student demographics, so who sorts into what school, might actually be more predictive of the variation in self-efficacy. And I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end. The one thing we do find that's similar to what we found at the student subgroup level is that self-efficacy doesn't really vary, the gender gap in self-efficacy doesn't vary among schools. So similarly to how we found it was consistent, the difference between males and females was consistent between white students, African-American students, Latinx students. We're seeing that if you're in a specific school, it's going to be consistent with another school. So what are the takeaways here? Well, as in the title of our paper, we think that there's a consistent gender achievement gap and a consistent decline in self-efficacy. In particular, self-efficacy declines in middle school for everyone, but much faster for female students, and that's regardless of what demographic subgroup or school you're in. And there's a large gender gap in favor of male students in middle and high school. And it is consistent no matter who you are and what context you're learning in. So the implications for this, it means that the factors that are driving self-efficacy gaps really are consistent and pervasive within different groups and across different contexts. So we really need to think about what factors shape male and females' self-efficacy or their confidence and their ability to do well in school, understanding how there are differences within the academic environments that male and female students have access to in their schools. Some of the things that we're considering are things like feedback, whether or not male and female students internalize feedback the same way, and whether or not they're receiving the same type of feedback. So all of those differences might be able to shed light on why we're seeing these large gaps that are consistent no matter who we're looking at. And with that, I want to thank you for my time, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Erin. So now we're going to hand it over to Susanna Loeb, who is going to talk about the results of 2 new studies on self-management and growth mindset. Susanna, you should have access to the screen. I can't hear you, Susanna. Susanna, we can't hear you. Susanna?
Is Susanna connected still? Maybe I can.
Okay, Susanna Claro, why don't you go?
Yeah.
Glad to have you.
Hi. Sorry for the noise. It may be a little noisy, but here it's a little less. Yeah. So I know we have tight time, so I'll be a little fast. This paper studies estimates the effects of self-management and growth mindset on academic achievement. And what I don't know is how I move the. Do I move the screen?
I can move it, Susanna.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, go to the next one. So the growth mindset, as you may know, it refers to the belief that intelligence is malleable instead of fixed. And self-management refers to the ability to regulate one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors in different situations. And there's evidence that both benefit student academic achievement in different ways, but most of the evidence that comes from, for example, from growth mindset is at 9th grade, and the outcomes only measure effects on GPA, which it's understood to include not just learning, but also already social-emotional skills. So we don't have much information on how mindset affects like raw measures of learning, we could say, like academic achievement by standardized tests. Or they always include some part of the other social emotional learning, but at least more than GPA. Also, we don't have enough evidence of subgroups. We don't know if the benefits of mindset and self-management are the same for every subgroup. For example, gender, there are no differences. I mean, there's no study showing gender differences or exploring the differences, actually. So this is the core districts brings an amazing opportunity to explore these questions. Go to the next slide. And there said that Susanna left the meeting. So these two papers, we first explore where there is variation on growth mindset between subgroups, which is also something that it's not known very much between student subgroups, and how these differences appear within schools. And then we'll go to the main part, which is the effects. How do growth mindset and self-management predict academic achievement a year later, and whether there are differences across subgroups. And we do these on students from 4th grade to 7th grade from years spring 2015 and 2016, those students who took the survey in those years and for whom we have academic achievement the year after and 2 years before that date. Let's keep the measures. I think you all know a lot about the measures. Also, that's self-management. We can skip it. There are more details in the papers. You can see how we explore each item separately, but here we skip that. So regarding variation, go to the next one. We find a similar trend that has been found in previous papers, that disadvantaged students report lower mindset levels. We can see here, this is the gap between the mindset gap between free and reduced price lunch and non-free and reduced price lunch is very consistent across grades. Also, parent education predicts lower mindset, and having been ELL also predicts lower mindset, but the gender difference is very small. And the interesting thing is that within school, when we go to the blue graph, that's within schools, the gaps are smaller than when we compare across all districts. And this may be because of self-sorting of students, or because there is an effect of the school that is changing the students' level of mindsets. Let's go to the next one. Self-management skills shows the similar pattern, but we see a greater gender gap between self-management skills. In self-management skills, females show much higher, but this starts reducing over the grades. And the within school gaps are also smaller, just as in mindset. Next one. Now we'll show the effects of mindset and self-management on academic achievement. The way we estimate this is that we compare students within a school grade that have similar characteristics, like same gender, similar previous achievement, parents' education, free and reduced price lunch status, etc., but who have differences in their mindset, for example. So within the school, we see whether there are differences in the next year's achievement test scores, and we take the average of all the schools. So let's ignore the solid bar. Let's just focus on the dashed bars. The blue dashed bar in the left, where it says mindset, that's the bar. That's the difference in achievement gain that an average student, that a student from an average school has with a growth mindset has with a student with a fixed mindset. So it's about 0.007 standard deviations of the score. And we can see that in self-management, that's the other dash bar, that bar shows the difference between a student with high self-management skills and a student with low self-management skills, but everything else equals, and they are in the same school and grade. So we see that self-management has a higher size, but let's see how important is this number, because 0.007 standard deviation is very small for psychological standards when you have studies in a lab. But let's go to the next slide. But the previous one. Here we use, when we compare with the annual growth in scores of the education system in the US, that was calculated, this is like sort of a back of an envelope calculation that Hanushek and colleagues did 6 years ago. If we use that to compare, then the effect of the growth mindset, the difference between growth mindset student and a fixed mindset student is of 48 days of learning a year after. And if we see for self-management, it's 80 days of learning in ELA. And this is a little smaller in math. Let's go for the next one. Another way to compare these effects is comparing with the gaps of demographics groups in the school. So here, these like light blue bars shows the difference in achievement gains between a student with free and reduced price lunch status and a student without free and reduced price lunch status in a school. So we see that we see ELL, Hispanic versus white, Asian versus white, special education versus non-special education. And the biggest gap in ELA is the one that females have with males. And we can see that the mindset effect is as big as many of these gaps, or a big proportion of them. And more interestingly, the self-management effect, or the self-management difference in gains, when all the way we estimated this effect, is as big as the biggest gap with between students with demographic differences. And in math, it's the same thing. So the students with high self-management versus low self-management have higher gains in ELA and math than any other, if we compare any other groups. And if we go to the next slide, we see that when we compare with the other dimensions that are evaluated in or measured in the core district survey, the self-management is the biggest predictor of gains in ELA and math. Mindset is the second in ELA, and self-efficacy is the second in math. We can go. So the third finding is about heterogeneity. Let's go to the next one. We're gonna go very fast through these graphs. We evaluated every subgroup different effect, and we see the very light dashed line that is in the middle of around the points is the average effect of mindset, and we see that most of the subgroups are very close to them, and more importantly, all of them are positive. The zero, you can see in the graph where the zero is, all of the effects are far away from the zero, besides the special ed group, which has no benefit of from mindset in math. Next one. And self-management, we see the same thing. We see a little bit more differences within race and ethnicity subgroups, but they are all positive and more or less as big. Let's go to the next one. The main differences we see when we compare by previous achievement levels, and we see in mindset that the students who benefit most from having a growth mindset are those with higher achievement levels previously. And this is a little bit against the theory, but it can be because of the type of schools we're observing. And this only happens in ELA. And in the next slide, we see the effect of self-management. And this is very interesting because we see a U-shape effect when we observe by previous achievement level. This means that the students with average achievement levels are those who benefit most from having a higher self-management skills. Next one. So to close, and maybe Susan, if you want to add something now that you could join, let me know. It's mindset and self-management gaps for disadvantaged students. We observe gaps for disadvantaged students on mindset and self-management skills. And we see that mindset predicts achievement gains in every grade, every subgroup, more in ELA than math, and more in higher grades than lower grades, and also in ELA for higher previous achievement students. And self-management predicts achievement gains also in every grade and every subgroup, and better than any other self-measure from the core district survey. Sorry that it's noisy now. Again. Right. And so the studies show evidence of the importance of measuring and monitoring these dimensions in school systems and for schools to address them directly. But that's still an open question. How can school systems promote these skills? Next one. Yep. So.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and I appreciate you jumping in with the technical difficulty. We're going to turn now to Hunter Gelbach, who's going to talk about recent work that he and a colleague did on understanding students' response patterns. Hunter, I will give you access to the screen now.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather. Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. Just to get things started off here. Sorry, I can't tell if there's a little delay on. There we go. I should be abundantly clear from the outset that I am merely arm candy on this study, and Christine Verissima gets all the credit for the heavy lifting and the hard work. But I can tell you a little bit about what I think is sort of so important and useful about this work. And so to start that conversation, if I can get the screen to nudge forward there. One of the things that I think we can all probably agree on fairly easily is that this focus on SEL, the focus on student social and motivational and self-regulatory development, is hugely important. So we've seen lots of evidence on that already. I think if you read through the other core papers or PACE papers, you'll see a lot of evidence of that too. And so if we take that as sort of a given, reasonable people could disagree a little bit on this next point, that surveys are the best way to measure students on these dimensions. But certainly once you get into the business of trying to measure these things at scale, it's really tough to beat surveys. And the capacity to get students to introspect about sort of how they feel about their sense of social connectedness, how motivated they are to pursue things, when and where their emotions are under control. It's, essentially you're going inside the student's head. And so at the moment, we really don't have much better technology to find out this information at scale. So one huge catch and potential, big problem is the average student, most of the time, not hugely motivated to take surveys. So whether you're administering the surveys in their class and maybe they're a little bit excited to get out of English class at the moment, or you're dragging them down to the cafeteria, more often than not, even if they start out happy to answer a couple questions, they don't find this super engaging material that is captivating their attention. And so the potential problems for this are huge, right? If they're not giving you good high fidelity answers, and combined with researchers assuming that the data they're getting back is good, is high fidelity, we could have a real problem on our hands in the sense that we care about this a lot, we're measuring it, but we're not paying as close attention to the caliber of the data that we're getting in as we might be. And so this is kind of the core issue of survey satisficing. Satisficing is this idea that students aren't putting in their most optimal effort and instead are kind of doing good enough. They're cutting some corners. And so what does this actually look like? And these are sort of the two questions we're going to focus on for this paper. So what does the survey satisficing look like? How bad is it? And the sort of subtext to this is, are there some easy, fairly light lift things that we, and by we, I would say not just researchers, but folks interested in collecting these sorts of data at the school and district level, can we all start keeping track and then at least having a little sense of how good the data are and whether we should be worried about the quality and maybe doing some different analyses as a result. And so, sorry, to jump back then to this definition or how we operationalize satisficing. So there are lots of different things you could look at, but 3 types of satisficing that are super easy. Pretty much anyone under any conditions, if you're administering a survey, could look at it, are skipping items. So pretty easy to spot when students just skip over an item. Early termination, if they end the survey early, there's 36 items on the survey, they stop at number 27. Again, very easy to identify, and you can do this algorithmically in statistical programs pretty easily. And then the final one is straight line responding. So sometimes students will just hit cruise control and respond in the same serial position on each and every item time after time after time. So, that 5th response option, that's the only thing they're circling. And, at times there will be strings in a row, but once you hit 10 was kind of how we defined it, and some other people previously have defined it. Once you hit about 10 in a row, especially if you're taking a hard look at the items, it's pretty rare that you're getting real responses at that point. So that's what we looked at. We went through and did sort of a pilot test on, I think it was the maybe 2015, 16 data sets, and then pre-registered a study and looked at pretty much the same thing the following year. So again, about 500,000 students in our data set. And here are the kind of big picture takeaways. So in terms of satisficing, we've got a couple different kinds. And overall, we find that 30% of the sample, just over 30% of the sample, is doing some form of satisficing. So whether it's skipping items or quitting early or giving all the answers right in a row in the same line, 30% overall are engaged in some form of satisficing, and a relatively modest percentage are engaging in more than one type of satisficing. So it seems like if you're going to blow off the survey, you're probably going to choose one strategy and blow off the survey in that way, rather than a lot of mixing and matching, although we did see a tiny bit of that. Interestingly, despite straight line responding being only 5%, In terms of its effect on the overall data quality and on the overall fidelity of what you're getting back as a researcher, straight lining has the biggest impact on sort of a per item basis. Because remember, as soon as you identify one straight line responder, that's 10 items in a row that we're assuming are no good. So we focused in on straight lining a little bit with one of our specific hypotheses and wanted to see how much that was affecting surveys, and also where students were straight lining, because if they are straight lining in particular places disproportionately, that could have an impact on the mean scores. And we do indeed find that on, I think all of these were 5 response option scales, they're almost always going all the way to the far right-hand side and straight lining in that column about half the time. The second highest, second most popular place to straight line is in the right in the middle, the third out of the 5 response options. So in terms of the impact on mean scores, because our data set was so big, this does have a significant impact, but in terms of effect size, it was actually fairly small and fairly modest. And then finally, the final thing we explored was that males were much more likely to satisfy than females, which for those who studied sort of upper elementary, middle, and high school students, this should probably not be a huge surprise. To just wrap up and maybe step back from the data a little bit and to editorialize a tiny bit, I was really surprised. So I've looked at this sort of stuff on a number of different surveys and was really worried that we were going to be in big trouble in terms of the integrity of the data. But looking at correlations with other scales, looking at all a whole number of things, running analyses with the sort of high integrity students who didn't commit any type of satisficing and then comparing the results to the full data set, it really didn't change things that much. Now, that's not to say by any stretch of the imagination that if you found some different data set or were looking at different sets of students or even particular schools and districts within core, that it could cause, for sure, it could cause a lot more mischief in any given data set. But for the most part, I think our headline conclusion is that the core surveys that we looked at were pretty robust to satisficing. So there was a fair bit of satisficing that occurred, but no huge red flags that we viewed as highly problematic in terms of the implications of that satisficing on the caliber of our data. And with that, I'll flip it back over to Heather. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hunter. Now we're going to hand it over to Libby for the last portion of our presentation to talk about what we've learned from recent analysis looking at classroom and teacher impacts. So Libby, you should be able to control.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Greetings from snowy Madison, Wisconsin. I'm going to very briefly talk about some new research that we've done to look at whether we can measure classroom supports for SEL by applying value-added models to the core district student surveys. I won't belabor how important SEL is for student success in terms of academics and longer-term life outcomes, as you're well aware of that by now. We know that educators can and do affect students' SEL skills, and there are studies that have been able to measure those impacts that teachers can have on students' non-cognitive skills in SEL. Our paper is trying to build on some of that research to explore whether we can estimate classroom level impacts on students' SEL at a large scale using the core district surveys. We have 3 key research questions here. First is whether we can detect classroom level impacts on students' growth in SEL after controlling for differences in prior SEL and in academic achievement. If we can detect those impacts, we're interested in how big or small they are. And we're also interested in whether classrooms where students are growing a lot in SEL are the same classrooms where students are growing a lot in academics. To do this analysis, we looked at about 44,000 fifth grade students in more than 3,500 classrooms across more than 700 schools in 5 of the core districts. We used the 2015-16 SEL survey as our pre-test measure when these students were in 4th grade, and the 2016-17 survey as the post-test measure when they were in 5th grade. We limited students for this analysis, limited our data set to students who were linked to one and only one teacher in both math and ELA, which means we excluded approximately 7,000 students from this particular data set. And this is important for ensuring that we have a consistent definition of what counts as a single classroom. Very briefly, I'll talk about how these growth models work. We estimate 6 different models for this paper. Each of the models predicts one of 6 different outcomes, either math score, ELA score, or scores for the 4 SEL competencies. So if you are an equation type of person, you can see on the bottom that we have 6 different outcomes on the left-hand side of the regression equation. We control for students' prior year scores in all 6 outcomes, so both their SEL prior scores and their prior scores in math and ELA, as well as student demographic characteristics. And then we estimate classroom fixed effects that allow us to quantify how much a particular classroom is impacting students' growth in that particular outcome. And for completion, we also have an intercept and error term. So our first research question asked whether we could detect classroom level impacts on students' growth in SEL. What you're looking at here is a goodness of fit measure for these models. We call this within classroom R squared. And overall, you can see that the SEL outcomes have a lower within classroom R squared than the academic outcomes. So this suggests that our models aren't controlling as well for other kinds of things that might impact students' SEL. So there's more variability that's left over to explain for the SEL models than the academic models. Here we show the values of the coefficient estimates. So on the right, you see the 6 different outcomes from our 6 different models. On the left, you see the prior year scores from the 6 different outcomes, math, ELA, and the 4 SEL competencies. I'll just say a couple high-level takeaways from this figure. First, for all 6 outcomes, the best predictor of the current year outcome is the prior year outcome in the same subject or competency. Second, in general, the math and ELA coefficients are higher than the SEL coefficients. That again relates to what we saw on the last slide, where the predictive power is stronger for those models than the SEL models. You'll see here that prior ELA is a strong predictor of growth mindset, almost as strong as prior growth mindset. Our hypothesis here is that we've done some other research showing that students are more likely to be confused by the wording of the growth mindset items, particularly in younger grades, and this is looking at 4th and 5th grade growth mindset. And this confusion is more prevalent for students who have lower reading ability, as well as students who are English language learners. So we think that some of what's going on here is that some of the growth mindset measure is measuring some reading ability as well. But we also like to point out that prior math stands out as a relatively strong predictor of current self-efficacy, which suggests a relationship there. And the last main takeaway here is that the SEL competencies are not interchangeable, meaning that growth in one SEL competency isn't associated with growth in another. So our second question asked, okay, if we can estimate these effects, how big or small are they? So what you're looking at here is the proportion of variance that we can explain at 3 different levels: at the school level, at the classroom level, and then at the individual student level. And here you're looking at kind of raw numbers as well as the proportion or the percent of variance explained. So what we can see is that for the 4 SEL measures, we do find measurable impacts at the classroom level. And importantly, these classroom level impacts are larger both in magnitude and in proportion than the school level impacts. We also see that there's more variance to explain at the student level for the SEL measures compared to math and ELA, both in terms of the magnitude and in terms of the proportion. Again, you'll recall that we had that lower within classroom R-squared, that lower predictive power for the SEL models, which means that there's more student level variability left over to explain. And what this means is that we actually see similar magnitude impacts across these 6 outcomes, but the actual proportion of variance explained is a little bit less for the SEL outcomes compared to the academic outcomes. Our last question asked whether or not classrooms with high SEL growth are the same classrooms with high academic growth. What you're looking at here is a heat map that shows correlations between classroom level impacts across the 6 different outcomes. So a couple things to point out. The relationship between impacts in ELA and math is 0.62 with a standard error of 0.01, which suggests that classrooms where students are growing in ELA in 5th grade also tend to see growth in math and vice versa. For social awareness, self-management, and self-efficacy, the correlation is 0 or close to 0 between those SEL skills and math and ELA. You'll see that growth mindset has a slightly higher correlation, particularly for ELA. Again, we think this in part has to do with the original growth mindset questions capturing some degree of reading ability because of the negative wording of these items. And I'll just note that this is one reason why the core districts prioritized pilot testing new versions of this construct, and eventually, as of this last school year, have adopted a positively worded version of this construct because of some of the concerns that have emerged from the negative wording. But the overall conclusion here is that classrooms where students are growing a lot in math and ELA aren't necessarily the same as classrooms where students are growing a lot in SEL and vice versa. And we think that's important because it suggests that there are positive classroom level supports and positive classroom culture and environment that might be real but aren't captured by traditional academic assessments. And so these SEL measures can help broaden the definition of student success and can help point to classrooms where things are going really well that might not be captured exclusively by academic standardized tests. A couple quick conclusions and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So this just shows essentially the magnitude of impacts that we estimated, and we see stronger impacts at the classroom level than we do at the school level for SEL. And as I mentioned, classrooms with high academic growth aren't necessarily the same as classrooms with high SEL growth and vice versa. This does align with several recent studies that have tried to quantify teacher impacts or classroom impacts on non-cognitive measures, but extends some of this prior work by establishing this across classroom within school variance using these SEL self-report survey measures administered at a large scale. We have a few ideas for where we'd like to go next. We'd like to expand this work to other grades. We'd like to be able to explore how persistent these effects are over time. I think there's a little lag of the slides now, so I'll just go off script. We're also interested in looking at additional or alternative approaches for correcting for measurement error in the surveys. This is particularly important when you estimate these kinds of growth models. And over time, we'd like to look at how these classroom level impacts on SEL can predict students' long-term outcomes. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Heather and we'll begin Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Libby. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that you can see all of the panelists' faces here while we engage in Q&A. So Libby, were there any questions that you highlighted that you would like to, that you saw in the Q&A that you would like to pose to the group?
Sure. We've already had a few questions answered in our Q&A box. There's one that Katie has asked for Hunter. Katie asked whether you've looked into if there was greater satisficing by other characteristics besides gender, so things like grade or attributes of the school.
Yeah, thank you. I'm slowly typing a response, but it'd certainly be easier to just say it. So we had a pre-registered hypothesis around the gender finding, which was, exactly as we suspected it would. but also did exploratory analyses around free and reduced price lunch, race. I feel like there were 2 or 3 other things that we identified in the report. And, you know, there were some small effects there, but I think the real headline finding was around gender. Nothing else that was particularly noteworthy from our vantage point. Thanks.
There's one other question here for Erin. When you looked at the gender gap in for students in middle school grades, did you look at the difference of school configuration, like what might be different if a student is in a K-8 school or a 6-8 school?
So we included indicators in our models that corresponded to that, but that was mainly as a control to control out some of the variation in terms of the types of schools that students were in. We did not separate out and look at, say, variation among K-6 schools and 6-8 schools to see, kind of level the playing field a little bit more. We just used all the schools together, allowing each one to vary away from the level and the trend so that they had some flexibility in that.
Great, thank you. And in the chat, I see that some of these were responded to, but I think it's worthwhile to bring it up. So one of the responses was, if you're using these measures in a school or district setting, and you know that there are issues around satisficing, would it be beneficial to flag the students that we think have unreliable responses? And Hunter, I'm curious what you think from your research about doing that from an operational perspective. And then Libby, what you think about that from a data operationalization perspective.
Great. Yeah, perfect setup, Heather. I think what you'll see in our report is 2 things. One is that we recommend first and foremost that people look at it and just get in a habit of making sure that they're running this analysis, you know, arguably more or less before you do anything else with your data set, just to see how bad the problem is. And again, we really tried to hit on these pretty common but low level, like easy to analyze, easy to detect forms of satisficing, which is not to say you shouldn't do more sophisticated things, but we really wanted to identify some stuff that anyone and everyone could do. And so I think step number 1, know what you're looking at. Did 10% of the sample satisfice, or was it more like 40 or 50%? And then second, it's again fairly trivial if you're running statistics to run your analyses for the sort of high integrity sample with no satisficers included, and then to rerun it with everyone. And then the final thought, and then I'll hand it off, is to just make sure you know what it's doing to your sample as well. So if you find that, you know, you're getting pretty different results and you're pretty nervous about the full sample and you really want to go with the high fidelity sample instead, does this change the demographics of your sample by you know, significant margins? Or are you suddenly having a really strong overrepresentation of females and underrepresentation of males because it was lots and lots of boys that you cut out of your sample? So that would be the sort of final thing that I think researchers would want to know. And then, you know, in terms of judgment calls, I think that is up to individual schools and districts, kind of professional instincts and intuitions. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll add on that was hard to follow up because a very thorough answer. But I think, you know, a lot of our research has been looking at these measures in the aggregate and using a really large sample. And so some of Hunter's findings align with the idea that it's not necessarily problematic in the aggregate. It's a very different question if you're talking about individual students who are potentially skipping a lot of items or satisficing, and what kinds of valid conclusions you can draw from that. I will mention too, there's been some other work, I know in Santa Ana, for instance, looking at whether response time can indicate measures of disengagement. And so I think there's a lot of interesting and innovative work out there to try and capture, is there a way to identify students who might be not engaged in the survey or might be displaying behaviors that might call into question whether you would want to include them in some kind of analysis. So I mentioned in the chat that for our research, we do use item response theory to produce scale scores rather than using raw scores. And so these papers are leveraging that. And that does help assuage some of those concerns because it can better handle missing data. And as Caroline pointed out in our chat, we only include students who respond to at least half of the items within a given construct, which further helps ensure that you're not drawing a conclusion based on a single item, for instance.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you very much to the panelists for sharing your research in this very quick fire way. I appreciate everybody's time today. And anyone on the line, if you have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Dave or to me or to any of the authors individually, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation. So have a wonderful day. Bye.